The Scythian Empire was known throughout the galaxy for its advanced technology and military might stretching across hundreds of star systems. The annual tournament was the pinnacle of their elite training program. Every young officer was expected to participate and prove their worth to their species. But this year something unusual happened in the midst of all the usual contenders. There was a surprise entry, one that had never been anticipated, a human child who had no idea what he was about to face. Ethan was just an ordinary 12-year-old boy living on Earth. He spent most of his time playing games on his console, particularly a Starship simulator. His grandfather had gifted him the simulator years ago, saying it was a way to help him learn the art of strategy and the tactics of warfare. As if it were a game, Ethan had always loved it, enjoying the idea of commanding a ship, battling enemies, and navigating vast space. He had never seen it as anything more than a fun distraction and a way to escape from the monotony of everyday life. But unbeknownst to Ethan, his grandfather had a past that tied him to the Scythian Empire, and one day he decided that Ethan should enter this grand tournament. When his invitation arrived, it seemed so absurd to the boy that he thought it must be a mistake or some sort of joke at first. He even questioned whether or not to go. His grandfather explained to him that the tournament wasn't just about the games, it was about demonstrating humanity's potential to other species. Even though Ethan didn't fully understand the significance of this statement, he accepted the invitation, thinking it was a way to show off his skills with his favorite game, a game where he spent countless hours commanding ships through dangerous missions and outwitting enemies in every battle. While the invitation arrived with pomp and circumstance, Ethan didn't see the gravity of what he was about to step into. The Scythian Empire considered itself to be the dominant force in the galaxy. Their technology and intelligence far exceeded anything that humans could fathom, or so they thought. The tournament's first round was nothing more than a simple simulator battle. But to the Scythians, this was a test of their young officers' skills and abilities. They didn't expect anyone from Earth to be able to stand up to them, but they were mistaken in their assumptions. Threx, an admiral in the Scythian fleet, stood at the control center of the simulation room, watching Ethan's arrival with mild amusement and deep skepticism. Humans were nothing more than fledglings in his eyes, a species that had only recently begun to venture into space, and certainly one that would have no chance against the might of his empire. Threx had seen many competitors fail before, but he didn't think the human child would even last 5 minutes against their advanced systems and AI designed for perfection. He chuckled to himself and prepared for what he thought would be a quick and easy victory in the simulation. As the screen flickered to life, Ethan's face appeared on the large central monitor, and with a wave of his hand, he began his first mission without hesitation. As the battle began, he commanded his ship with a precision that surprised even his own AI assistant. His every move felt deliberate and calculated, far beyond the limits of a child's imagination. But the Scythian Empire wouldn't recognize this, not yet, not until they witnessed the full scope of what humanity was truly capable of. Ethan's heart raced as the massive Scythian ship loomed closer on his screen. Its glowing engines lit up the space around him, and its weapon systems were primed for an attack. He didn't have time to hesitate. His fingers flew over the console, issuing commands to his ship's AI crew, coordinating maneuvers as he prepared for the next move. His instincts kicked in. This wasn't just about playing the game anymore. It was about using everything he knew to survive. He activated his ship's cloaking system, a feature he had never thought to use in earlier rounds, but it seemed like the only chance he had now. The ship flickered briefly before disappearing from the radar, leaving the massive Scythian ship to scan the empty space. Ethan's plan was simple but effective. He would use the Scythian ship's overwhelming firepower against it. He'd been watching its movements closely, studying the way it acted in previous simulations. Every fleet had its predictable behaviors, its weaknesses, and the Scythian ship was no exception. The seconds felt like hours as Ethan moved his ship into position. The cloaking system wouldn't last long, so he had to make every moment count. He focused all of his energy on the next phase of his plan. The AI had done well up to this point, but now he had to think like a human, relying on unpredictability and raw instinct. Ethan knew that the Athenians would expect him to follow their usual tactics. But he wasn't going to play by their rules. His mind raced through the strategies he'd learned from history, tactics that weren't about overwhelming firepower, but about outsmarting the enemy. He deactivated the cloak and launched his ship toward the massive dreadnought, making a beeline for the weak spot he had noticed earlier in the simulation, a gap in the enemy ship's shields, a vulnerability that only someone with a creative mindset might notice. As he closed in, the Scythian ship turned sharply to meet him, its guns firing in rapid succession. But Ethan was ready. At the last moment, he activated his ship's evasive thrusters, diving under the heavy fire and moving swiftly toward the weak point. The Scythian ship's fire hit the empty space where Ethan's ship had been just moments before. The Scythian commanders, who had been monitoring the simulation, stared in disbelief. They had never seen such a daring move, especially not from a human. Admiral Threx's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the expected outcome. Ethan wasn't just surviving. He was outwitting them at every turn. Ethan's ship rocketed forward, closing in on the vulnerable gap in the enemy's defenses. He pressed the fire button, unleashing a series of concentrated plasma blasts at the weak point. The Scythian ship's shields flickered and crackled as the blasts hit their mark. For a moment, nothing happened, and Threx thought the shield would hold. But then, with a sudden flash of light, the shields collapsed, and the Scythian ship's core systems started to overload. The massive dreadnought shuddered violently, its systems failing as Ethan's ship tore through the defenses. Within moments, the ship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, its wreckage scattered across the simulated battlefield. Threx stood there in stunned silence. The Scythian officers around him exchanged looks of disbelief. A human child had just taken down the mightiest ship in their entire fleet. Threx had seen many great tacticians in his time, but what Ethan had just done was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It wasn't just that the boy had survived. It was how he had done it, how he'd exploited weaknesses that no one else had even considered. The child's approach wasn't based on technology or superior weapons. It was based on something far more dangerous: human creativity. The room fell silent as Ethan's victory was confirmed. Threx, still processing what had just happened, couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing the beginning of something monumental. The silence in the command room was heavy. Threx stood frozen, staring at the glowing display where the human child's victory was now fully confirmed. Ethan had taken down the most formidable ship in the Scythian fleet, something no one had expected. Threx's thoughts raced. He had underestimated humanity. But this was something else. He had seen countless officers fail in these simulations, but none had ever shown this level of brilliance. The Admiral, still in disbelief, turned to his officers. "Prepare the next simulation," he ordered curtly, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. His pride had taken a hit, and something nagged at him. Something deeper than just the shock of defeat. Increase the difficulty. He muttered to himself, hoping that the child's victory had simply been luck. Ethan, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the gravity of what he'd accomplished. He was still sitting in front of his console, his fingers resting on the controls. He wasn't feeling the weight of a victory over a powerful fleet or an alien empire. He was just relieved the simulation was over. The rush of the battle had faded, replaced by the same calm he had always felt after a successful mission in the game. He didn't realize that what had just happened would change the course of humanity's future. The next challenge came swiftly, but Threx was not about to let the human child off that easily. He had pulled out all the stops for the next round. An assault scenario that simulated a surprise attack by a vastly superior fleet, something designed to overwhelm any participant. The AI-controlled enemies would be relentless, the terrain more hazardous, and the stakes higher. Threx was determined to see Ethan fail. As the new simulation began, the screen in front of Ethan flickered to life again. The interface had changed. A new fleet of enemy ships appeared, each one more advanced and more intimidating than the last. Massive warships with powerful energy weapons lined up against him, and as Ethan surveyed the situation, his fingers immediately went to work, analyzing the field. He was used to these kinds of challenges, used to fighting against overwhelming odds, used to thinking his way out of dangerous situations. He had done it countless times before, and his confidence began to return. Ethan began by deploying his fleet strategically, keeping some ships back as decoys, while the majority of his forces moved in to flank the enemy. He recognized the layout of the battlefield, the angles, the positions, the weaknesses in the enemy formation. He had seen these kinds of tactics used in historical battles, and he knew exactly how to make them work. As he issued orders to his fleet, a quiet smile spread across his face. But Threx wasn't watching idly. He had ordered the simulation to alter the behavior of the enemy fleet to make them more aggressive, more intelligent, even unpredictable. The Tythian fleet moved in waves, not following standard patterns anymore. They anticipated Ethan's maneuvers. They were adapting, something the simulation had never done before. It was designed to test his limits. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. His ships were taking heavier fire than expected, and the enemy seemed to predict his every move. His mind raced as he quickly recalculated his plan. The AI assistants on his ship were advising him, but Ethan wasn't going to follow their advice this time. This situation called for something different, something more human. He ordered one of his ships to make a risky maneuver, engaging in a kamikaze-style attack on one of the enemy's key command ships, sacrificing a small portion of his fleet to take down the bigger threat. The action was bold, reckless even, but it worked. The enemy fleet was thrown into disarray as the targeted command ship exploded in a burst of light. Threx watched, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he realized this human child was more than just a fluke. The tactics he was using were unconventional, not bound by the same rules that Scythians had relied on for generations. Ethan's ability to think creatively, to take risks that others would deem foolish, was something Threx had never seen before. He could no longer dismiss it as mere luck. As Ethan continued to outmaneuver the Scythian fleet, a slow realization began to form in Threx's mind. The simulation was no longer just a game. Ethan's strategies were real, drawn from history, from battles fought by humans long before the Scythians had even known of their existence. The human race, despite their lack of advanced technology, was proving to be far more dangerous than Threx had ever anticipated. The battle raged on, and as Ethan's tactics continued to confound the Scythian fleet, the Admiral's confidence began to crack. He had expected the human child to falter, to make mistakes under pressure, but instead, Ethan was turning the battlefield into a playground for his ingenuity. Each move was calculated, precise, and unpredictable, like nothing Threx had ever seen before. The child wasn't just surviving the onslaught. He was thriving in it, playing a game with stakes far beyond his years. Threx clenched his fists, his thoughts racing. This shouldn't be happening. He's just a child. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Ethan was systematically dismantling the Scythian forces, exploiting every opening, using the very terrain of the simulation against them. He had already neutralized several ships, taking advantage of every opportunity to weaken the enemy, forcing them into positions where they couldn't defend themselves. His mind worked like a well-oiled machine, but it wasn't just the efficiency of his moves that unsettled Threx. It was the creativity. In one daring move, Ethan lured a fleet of ships into an asteroid belt, using the large space rocks as cover. His ships dodged behind them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Scythians, predictably, relied on brute force, charging headfirst into the dense field of debris without considering the risks. Ethan's ships fired from hidden positions, picking off smaller targets one by one before retreating into the cover once more. The Scythians were in disarray, unsure of where the attacks were coming from. Threx watched this unfold, his hands shaking slightly as he realized that Ethan wasn't simply playing a game. He was proving something fundamental about the human race. His tactics were not about overpowering the enemy. They were about outwitting them. Where the Scythians relied on overwhelming strength and advanced technology, Ethan relied on adaptability, on thinking in ways that the enemy couldn't anticipate. This child's approach was something the Scythians had never needed to consider, and it was winning. As the simulation drew closer to its climax, Threx became desperate. He ordered the creation of a new, more powerful threat, a fleet of Scythian warships with enhanced AI, designed specifically to counter Ethan's creative strategies. This new force was larger, more aggressive, and more coordinated. Threx wanted to see if Ethan could still think his way out of an encounter where the odds were so stacked against him. He activated the fleet and watched as it appeared on the battlefield. Massive ships emerging from the darkness of space, their weapons powered and ready. Ethan, however, showed no signs of fear or hesitation. Instead, he took a deep breath, his mind already analyzing the situation. The new fleet was formidable, but there were weaknesses he could exploit. He zoomed in on the lead ship, a massive dreadnought that had the highest firepower, but also the most vulnerable weak points. It was a formidable opponent, but Ethan recognized that even the strongest ship could be undone by strategy, by using its size and power against it. He issued a command to his fleet, redirecting them to the outer edges of the battlefield. His ships began to scatter, creating a series of decoys designed to confuse the enemy eye. The Scythians had assumed the humans would fight head-on, relying on sheer strength, but Ethan had different plans. He would lead them into a trap, a carefully crafted maneuver that relied not on raw firepower, but on overwhelming the enemy's sensors and communication systems. As the Scythian fleet pursued, Ethan's decoys drew the warships into the most dangerous part of the simulation, the black hole zone. Here, the gravitational pull would distort the enemy's targeting systems and cause their formations to collapse. Ethan's fleet darted in and out of the zone, striking from unexpected angles, forcing the Scythians into a chaotic retreat. The plan worked flawlessly. One by one, the Scythian ships began to falter, unable to keep up with the unpredictable tactics. Threx watched, his jaw clenched. Impossible, he thought, unable to process the defeat that was unfolding before him. The human child had outsmarted them once again. The final blow came swiftly, and Threx couldn't do anything to stop it. The last of his fleet, once so powerful, was now a shattered remnant, caught in the gravitational pull of the black hole. The battle that had begun with such confidence had ended in disaster. One by one, the ships disintegrated, unable to escape the trap Ethan had set for them. The Scythian Empire's pride had been crushed by a human child, someone who had never even been trained for warfare beyond the virtual realm. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the screen in front of him, his chest rising and falling with the rush of adrenaline that still lingered. For a moment, he wasn't sure whether to celebrate or to just accept that the game was over. It had been one of the most intense challenges he'd ever faced, but it was still just a simulation. He hadn't expected this much difficulty, but in the end, he had won. That was all that mattered, wasn't it? Yet, as he leaned back, he began to realize something. This wasn't just a game anymore. The feeling of victory wasn't quite as satisfying as he'd anticipated. The weight of what he'd done began to settle over him. He had outmaneuvered an entire alien fleet, using nothing but his wits and the strategies he'd learned from countless hours of gaming. But there was more to this than just proving he could be the best. There was something bigger at play here, something he didn't fully understand but could feel tugging at the edges of his mind. As Ethan sat in quiet contemplation, Threx's voice broke the silence, his tone sharper than before. "Stop the simulation," he ordered, and the simulation grid immediately froze. Ethan's ship came to a halt, and the battlefield around him disappeared, replaced by a blank screen. Threx's image flickered onto the display. "Impressive." The Scythian Admiral's voice came through, calm but heavy with an undertone of something deeper. "I did not expect this outcome. You are different from the other human participants." There is something about your thinking, your strategies. It is not based on technology alone. You rely on something else. Intuition. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't used to hearing praise, especially not from an alien who had just been soundly defeated. "Oh, thanks, I guess. It's just a game, right?" Threx stared at him through the screen, his gaze intense. "This is no longer just a game, human. The galaxy is not a playground. What you have done here has shown me something significant. You possess the capacity to think beyond what we have encountered. Your species is unpredictable." Ethan's heart began to pound in his chest. The realization of what was happening hit him like a wave. This wasn't some routine simulation. He was part of something much bigger now. The tournament, once a way to prove his skills, had transformed into a true test of humanity's potential in the face of a galaxy full of vastly superior species. "Are you saying we've passed?" Ethan asked hesitantly, unsure whether to feel proud or anxious. He had no idea what Threx was implying, but the weight of the conversation was beginning to sink in. Threx's eyes narrowed. "Not past. Not yet, but you have proven your worth. You are capable of far more than we expected. Your strategies may have been unconventional, but they were effective. The Tythian Empire does not take kindly to being outwitted." Ethan didn't know whether to be excited or terrified. The Tythian Empire, he'd learned, was one of the most powerful and advanced civilizations in the galaxy. If they were noticing humanity's potential, that could mean good things, or it could mean that they would start seeing Earth as a threat. "We've only just begun," Threx continued, his voice carrying a heavy tone. "This is merely the first step. But be warned, human. The next rounds will not be so forgiving. Your species has caught the attention of far more than just me. You may have won today, but the real test is yet to come." Ethan swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine. For the first time, he realized that the stakes of this tournament had gone far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The fate of humanity might rest on how well he played the next round. And this time, the game would be for real. Ethan sat in stunned silence as the weight of Threx's words settled over him. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He had entered this tournament with no idea of its true significance, thinking it would be a simple competition. But now, it seemed as if he had just stepped into a much larger arena, one where the stakes were not just about proving his skill in a game, but about representing the survival and future of humanity itself. Threx's image flickered on the screen again, his alien face as unreadable as ever. "Prepare yourself, human. The next round begins shortly. And know this, you are no longer just a child playing at war. You are a representative of your species. Your actions from this moment forward will determine if humanity is to be seen as an ally or as a threat." Ethan felt his throat go dry. He had expected to play a few more rounds, win some virtual medals, maybe make a name for himself in a game he loved. But now he realized he had become something much more. He was the face of humanity, the first human to step into a galactic stage, where life and death, war and peace, were decided by the turn of a strategy. "Who else is in this competition?" Ethan asked, his voice steadier than he felt. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know, but he couldn't help but ask. If this was more than just a game, what other powers were watching? What other species were competing? Threx's cold, calculating eyes met his. "There are many species, human, each more advanced than you can imagine. Some are friends, others are enemies. Some would see humanity as an asset. Others would view you as a threat to be destroyed. But regardless of their intentions, all will be watching your every move." Ethan swallowed hard. The words echoed in his mind as the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He was just a kid, no different than anyone back home. He didn't know if he could carry the burden of an entire species on his shoulders. He had always been good at games, but this wasn't a game anymore. This was the survival of humanity in a galaxy that was as dangerous as it was vast. Threx's tone softened, just for a moment. You have proven yourself capable in the first round, human. But the true test is not in tactics alone. The next challenges will test your ability to lead, to think beyond your own survival, and to make decisions that could change the course of history. Before Ethan could respond, the screen flickered once more, and the simulation grid reappeared. This time, however, there was a new sense of urgency. Ethan's surroundings seemed different now, less like a game and more like an actual battlefield. He was no longer seated at a console in a quiet room. He was at the helm of a real ship, with a crew of AI officers staring at him expectantly. The voice of his AI assistant, a calm and composed voice that had guided him through the earlier rounds, now spoke with a new seriousness. "Commander, we've entered enemy territory. The Scythian fleet has been dispatched, and we are within range of an unknown force. It is highly recommended that we engage immediately, but I advise caution." Ethan's mind snapped into action, his hands instinctively hovering over the controls. The room around him seemed to fade as he focused solely on the mission ahead. He wasn't playing a game anymore. He was the commander of a ship, leading a crew into the heart of danger. The survival of his crew, and possibly the fate of Earth, depended on his decisions. "Status report," he said, his voice firm. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a leader. "Unknown ships approaching," the AI replied. "They are heavily armed, far more advanced than any known species. Their intentions are unclear." Ethan's mind raced, recalling all the strategies he had learned from the simulator. But this wasn't a game where he could restart if things went wrong. He had one chance to make the right decision. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Ethan ordered. "Lock onto their lead ship. I want to know their weak points. We'll use their overconfidence against them." The AI acknowledged his command, and the ship's sensors flared to life as enemy vessels came into view. This was no longer just a test of skill. It was a test of humanity's future, and Ethan was determined not to let the human race fail. Ethan's hands were steady, but his mind was racing. The unfamiliar hum of the ship's engines echoed in his ears as he studied the enemy ships on his display. Their sleek, angular forms were unlike anything he had seen in the simulation. These were real enemies, not just digital opponents. He wasn't sure if he was prepared for this, but there was no turning back now. The Scythians had made it clear. His decisions would have consequences far beyond the confines of a game. "Commander," the AI assistant said, its voice cool and collected. "We are within range. The enemy ships are activating their weapon systems. They are likely preparing for an engagement." Ethan took a deep breath. His mind flashed back to his previous victories, the strategies he had used, and the tactics that had carried him through so far. But this was different. He wasn't facing a fleet that followed predictable patterns. These ships were more advanced, their designs alien in every sense. Their technology was beyond what humanity had ever encountered, and they could wipe him out in seconds if they wanted to. But Ethan had something they didn't, his ability to think unpredictably. "We can't just rely on firepower," he said, his voice firm with newfound determination. "We need to get inside their heads, anticipate their moves, use their strength against them. Prepare a decoy. We're going to force them to reveal their vulnerabilities." The AI hummed with acknowledgement. "Understood. Deploying decoy ships." The simulation, which had always been an arena of structured rules and strategies, was now completely unpredictable. Ethan knew that a frontal assault would be suicide. His best chance was to confuse the enemy, make them doubt their advantage, and then exploit any weakness that appeared. This was the kind of thinking that had won him the previous rounds, and it was the only chance he had now. He watched as the decoy ships, small, expendable vessels, broke away from his fleet, drifting slowly into the path of the incoming enemy. As expected, the alien ships reacted quickly, opening fire on the decoys, trying to eliminate the threat before it could become a problem. But Ethan wasn't fooled. The enemy was overcommitting. The decoys were a distraction, not a real threat. He had to move fast. "Now full speed evasive maneuver," he ordered, his eyes locked on the lead enemy ship. The fleet lurched as his command was executed. His ship darted sideways, skimming just past a massive asteroid that had been sitting in the vicinity, its size enormous, its gravity potentially deadly. The enemy fleet, focused on the decoys, was caught off guard as Ethan's ship emerged from behind the asteroid, guns blazing. The first salvo struck the lead alien ship, damaging its shields and sending it veering off course. The alien fleet had underestimated the humans' ability to think in ways they couldn't predict, and it cost them. But the victory was short-lived. "Warning," the AI warned urgently. "The enemy fleet has initiated countermeasures. They are adapting faster than we anticipated. They've activated their cloaking technology. We can no longer track them directly." Ethan's stomach dropped. Cloaking technology. He had seen it in a few simulations before, but the way the enemy had employed it felt more sophisticated, almost seamless. The ships were now invisible to his sensors, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if he had lost his advantage. But then Ethan remembered something. Something that Scythians had failed to account for. "Activate the spatial distortion sensors," he said quickly. "We'll use the gravitational anomalies from the nearby asteroid field to detect their movements." The AI complied, and Ethan watched as the sensor grid flickered to life. The distortion fields from the nearby asteroids were subtle but present, and it was enough to give him a hint of the cloaked enemy ship's positions. He knew the enemy would expect him to stay passive, to wait for them to make the first move. But that wasn't how humans won wars. Ethan had learned this lesson well from history. The key was to keep the enemy on their toes, to never give them the chance to dominate. He smiled grimly, then issued his next order. "Fire at the last known positions of the enemy fleet. Unleash everything we've got. We'll hit them before they can adjust." His ship's weapon systems hummed to life, unleashing a barrage of energy blasts into the darkness, targeting the distortions in the field that indicated the enemy's positions. The first shots missed, but the next struck home. Bright flashes of light erupted in the void as several alien ships took direct hits, their cloaks flickering for a moment before they collapsed. The enemy wasn't just technologically superior, they were too reliant on their power. They thought their technology would be enough to win the battle, but they hadn't accounted for one thing: humanity's resourcefulness, its ability to find new angles and creative solutions even in the most dire circumstances. The Scythians had underestimated Ethan once again, and for the first time, he could see the glimmer of victory on the horizon. The battlefield was chaotic now. Ethan's mind raced as the enemy ships reeled from the unexpected onslaught. Their cloaking technology had failed to save them, and for the first time since the simulation began, the Scythian fleet seemed unsure. The vast alien warships drifted, erratic and confused, their once perfect formations in disarray. They were being outmaneuvered by a human, a single child who had never seen real war. But Ethan knew he couldn't afford to relax. He had won no more than a temporary advantage. The Scythians were adaptable, and their next move could be deadly. The alien fleet's power far outstripped his own, but he had learned one important truth from this experience. Strength alone wasn't enough to win a war. It was how you used that strength, how you exploited every opportunity, no matter how small. "Commander," the AI's voice broke through his thoughts. "The lead enemy ship is attempting a retreat. Should we pursue?" Ethan's hand hovered over the control panel. His gut told him to finish it now, but his mind reminded him that this was bigger than a single victory. If the enemy fleet retreated, they might regroup, bring reinforcements, and return with a vengeance. This wasn't just about winning battles. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity wasn't just another species to be brushed aside. "We can't let them escape," Ethan said, his voice sharp with purpose. "Pursue, but don't overcommit. We need to ensure they can't regroup, but we also need to stay cautious." The ship's engines roared to life as they accelerated toward the retreating Scythian vessel. Ethan's thoughts were clouded with uncertainty, but he steeled himself. His crew, composed of AI officers, trusted him to lead them. There was no room for doubt now. As they closed the distance, the enemy ship turned sharply, attempting to escape the range of Ethan's weapons. But it was too late. Ethan had anticipated the move. He had already calculated the trajectory, the timing. He fired first. The energy beams tore through the vacuum of space, striking the Scythian ship's weak spots. It flared with an explosion, massive and blinding. For a moment, Ethan couldn't see anything, the brilliance of the blast searing his retinas. Then, as the afterimage faded, he saw the shattered remains of the enemy ship, its energy systems completely fried. But there was no time to celebrate. "Commander," the AI reported urgently, "multiple enemy ships have just entered our range. It seems we've triggered their backup fleet. They're heavily armed and closing in fast." Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped the Scythians would be forced to retreat, but this was far from over. The backup fleet was larger, more powerful than anything he had faced so far. And now he was alone in deep space, facing the might of the Scythian Empire, with only a handful of ships left to defend him. For the first time in this battle, Ethan felt fear. Real, gut-wrenching fear. But it didn't paralyze him. It sharpened his focus. "I'm not running," Ethan said, his voice low and determined. "We don't retreat. We fight." He quickly gave the order to deploy the last of his decoys and ordered his fleet to scatter, using the asteroid belt as cover. The backup fleet was formidable, but they had no idea how ruthless humanity could be when cornered. Ethan wouldn't let them win. Not like this. Not after everything he had fought for. As the enemy fleet closed in, Ethan waited, watching their movements, waiting for the perfect moment. He could feel the tension rising, every second stretching out, stretching time itself. The enemy ships closed in, unaware that their prey was waiting to strike back with everything they had left. Then, with a single decisive command, Ethan launched a series of desperate but calculated attacks. His fleet engaged the enemy head-on, and in a flurry of brilliant light, ships collided, traded fire, and exploded. The battle was chaotic, and it was clear that the Scythians had underestimated the human resolve. And then, in the middle of the chaos, it happened. The Scythian backup fleet, caught off guard by Ethan's audacity, faltered. One by one, their ships began to fall. It wasn't just the firepower that did it. It was Ethan's relentless drive, his refusal to back down, and his understanding that victory came not from raw power, but from the heart of a warrior who would never surrender. In the end, it was the human will that won the day. The last of the Scythian ships fell, and silence descended over the battlefield. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His hands were trembling, but he had done it. He had saved his fleet, and in doing so, he had made a statement that the galaxy would not soon forget. "Victory, Commander," the AI's voice came softly, almost reverently. "Humanity's place in the galaxy has been secured." Ethan closed his eyes, his body still trembling, not just from the adrenaline, but from the weight of what he had just accomplished. He had won not just a game, but the future of his entire species. And he knew, in that moment, that humanity had just begun to make its mark on the galaxy.